Before we dive into detailed discussion, kindly subscribe to our channel. It motivates us to continue this work. Also, share your thoughts about this in comments, as they are the only way we can talk to each other. I love reading your comments. And now let's continue. Friends, for years, France had been mining gold reserves in Burkina Faso, quietly pulling billions of dollars worth of treasure from beneath African soil. The shimmering gold bars were flown to refineries in Europe, polished, branded, and sold to global markets. But in Burkina Faso itself, no refinery was ever built. Not a single gold bar was stamped "Made in Burkina Faso." Instead, the riches of the land were exported raw, leaving behind only dust, dangerous jobs, and a political class fattened by bribes. For ordinary Burkinabes, the reality was cruel. They saw trucks leaving the mines. They heard of billions in revenue, and yet their own families struggled on less than $2 a day. It was a story as old as colonialism. Africa rich in resources, yet poor in dignity. This is where the name Ibrahim Traoré enters the conversation. A young, fire-eyed leader who rose to power at only 34, Traoré has become a symbol of rebellion against that old system. For many in Africa, he represents the return of Thomas Sankara's spirit, the revolutionary of the 1980s who once told his people that dignity and independence mattered more than foreign approval. And now Traoré faces a question that could either liberate Burkina Faso or plunge it into stormy waters. What if Ibrahim Traoré nationalized all mineral resources? Nationalization. The word itself carries weight, history, and danger. It means the state takes back control of its natural wealth, kicking out foreign companies, ending corrupt contracts, and declaring that the riches of the soil belong first to the people. For Burkina Faso, it would mean that instead of French, Canadian, or Australian companies owning the mines, the Burkinabe government would own them. It would mean no more raw gold being shipped out to Europe without being refined locally. It would mean jobs, industries, and opportunities created, not in Paris or Toronto, but in Ouagadougou and beyond. But before we imagine what Traoré might do, we must understand the past that led here. For decades, France and its companies dominated Burkina Faso's mining sector. Contracts were often signed in secret, designed to favor outsiders, while politicians received bonuses to stay quiet. Mining companies claimed they brought jobs, but those jobs were few, dangerous, and poorly paid. Villages near mines often lost their farmland, and rivers were poisoned by chemicals like cyanide used in gold extraction. Meanwhile, gold accounted for more than 70% of Burkina Faso's exports. Yet the wealth never trickled down. The foreign companies exported raw materials, left environmental scars, and avoided creating local industries. This exploitation was not an accident. It was by design. By keeping Burkina Faso dependent, France maintained its grip over West Africa long after formal colonialism ended. The CFA franc, the currency used in Burkina Faso and tied directly to the French treasury, ensured that even money flowed in Paris's direction. The gold mines were part of the same story. Wealth left Africa while dependency remained. And to the young generation of Burkinabés, this was intolerable. So imagine now, Ibrahim Traoré takes the podium, standing before a sea of citizens, and announces that all mineral resources will be nationalized. Gold, uranium, manganese, zinc, all taken from the hands of foreign corporations and placed under state control. The announcement would send shockwaves across Africa, Europe, and the financial markets. For the people of Burkina Faso, it would ignite hope. For foreign companies, it would trigger panic. And for France, it would be nothing less than a declaration of war against its economic empire. The immediate effects would be dramatic. First, mining companies currently operating in Burkina Faso would either be expelled or forced to renegotiate under strict state terms. Instead of owning 80% or 90% of the mines, they might be reduced to minority partners or cut out entirely. This would free billions of dollars in annual revenues. Currently, most profits vanish abroad, with Burkina Faso only receiving small royalties and taxes. Under nationalization, the state could capture up to 70 to 80% of total profits, injecting them directly into the national budget. What would that mean for the people? Jobs. Thousands of them, not just in mining, but in related industries. If the government built gold refineries inside Burkina Faso, locals could work as technicians, engineers, jewelers, accountants, security staff, and transporters. The gold supply chain is vast. Digging is only the first step. Melting, refining, stamping, and exporting are entire industries in themselves. Economists estimate that if Burkina Faso refined even half of its own gold, it could create 50,000 new jobs within 5 years. If combined with industrialization of other minerals, the number could surpass 100,000. For a nation where youth unemployment fuels despair, that is revolutionary. The economy would transform. Instead of raw gold leaving the country cheaply, Burkina Faso could sell finished bars or jewelry at global prices. Instead of being merely a pit stop for resource extraction, it could become a regional hub of gold trade, finance, and industry. And beyond gold, there are uranium deposits, desperately sought by nuclear powers. There is manganese, vital for steel production. There is zinc, essential in global manufacturing. Traore could declare that all these industries must serve the Burkinabe people first, but it would not come without risks. France and other Western powers would react fiercely. Nationalization would threaten billions in corporate profits. Sanctions could be imposed. Aid could be cut. Loans from institutions like the IMF and World Bank could dry up. Western media might brand Traore as a dictator, echoing the campaigns once launched against Sankara, Gaddafi, or Nkrumah. There could even be covert attempts to destabilize his government, using political rivals or armed groups to stir chaos. History shows us this pattern. When African leaders assert independence, they rarely do so without facing external retaliation. This is why alliances would be crucial. Traore would likely turn toward new partners, Russia, China, Turkey, or members of the BRICS bloc. These nations would eagerly buy Burkina Faso's gold and uranium, providing alternative markets and investment. In return, they might build the refineries, the infrastructure, and the railways that Burkina Faso would need to sustain nationalization. A pivot eastward would be both a necessity and a strategy for survival. And then comes the question of governance. Nationalization is not just about declaring ownership. It requires management, expertise, and above all, honesty. If the same corrupt politicians who once sold contracts to foreigners now control billions in mineral revenue, little would change. The danger of corruption remains. The success of nationalization would depend on whether Traore could install honest managers, transparent systems, and strong oversight. Otherwise, the gold that once enriched Paris would simply enrich a new class of elites in Ouagadougou. Still, for ordinary Burkinabés, the dream is alive. They remember how foreign companies mined their gold, but never built a single refinery. They remember how billions left, while villages remained in poverty. To them, nationalization is not just an economic policy. It is justice. It is dignity. It is the promise that their children will not inherit poverty while strangers inherit wealth. And that is why the idea of Traore nationalizing mineral resources has captured imaginations, not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa. Because if one small, landlocked nation could do it, others might follow. Mali, Niger, Guinea, countries with similar struggles might see Traore's boldness as a signal to reclaim their own resources. A domino effect could shake the entire neo-colonial structure of West Africa. And that is what makes this possibility so explosive. For decades, France had been more than just a distant power in West Africa. It had been the silent hand on the levers of wealth, draining gold, cotton, and other resources from the soil, while leaving behind very little for the people who actually owned it. If part one of our story traced the shadows of this exploitation and the bold decision of Ibrahim Traoré to nationalize Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, part two is where we begin to see the sparks of possibility, the kind of transformations that could ripple through a country when its resources are finally in the hands of its own people. Let us imagine the scene in Ouagadougou, just days after the announcement. A country buzzing with curiosity, skepticism, but also pride. Ordinary Burkinabe farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers suddenly feel as though something monumental has happened, though they can't yet grasp the scale. But the foreign companies, the ones who for decades held secret contracts, who shipped raw gold to Europe without refining a single ounce in Burkina Faso, they understand exactly what is at stake. For them, the announcement is not just a disruption. It is a revolution. History shows us that nationalization is not a new story. In the 1960s and 70s, leaders across Africa, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's own revolutionary hero, spoke about the dangers of foreign control over natural resources. Sankara, in particular, understood that a country feeding off aid while exporting raw wealth was a country trapped in a cycle of dependency. His assassination cut short those ambitions, but in Traoré, many Burkinabe see a resurrection of that dream. And so, the nationalization of mineral resources is not just an economic policy. It is a revival of a buried vision. But what does this mean practically? Imagine gold refineries sprouting up not in Paris or Geneva, but in the heart of West Africa. A single medium-sized refinery, experts say, could employ thousands directly, from engineers and technicians to security staff and transporters. Around those refineries, entire ecosystems would grow. Local manufacturers supplying tools and chemicals, logistics companies managing transport, banks providing services to newly employed workers. And suddenly, the money that once fled into foreign accounts begins to circulate within the Burkinabe economy. Jobs are the most immediate effect. Analysts estimate that full control of mineral resources could create up to 50,000 direct and indirect jobs in Burkina Faso within the first decade. To a nation where unemployment and underemployment suffocate opportunity, this is no small matter. But it's not just about jobs. With revenues flowing into state coffers, the government can reinvest in the basics that the French companies never cared to touch. Schools, roads, hospitals, clean water systems. Every ounce of gold refined locally means more funds to modernize the very fabric of the nation. And yet, history warns us that this path is not without challenges. The moment a leader attempts to wrest control of resources from entrenched powers, resistance begins. Sanctions, capital flight, even destabilization attempts. We've seen this with leaders like Patrice Lumumba in Congo, or even more recently with oil politics in Venezuela. The French government, though less overt today, still wields influence through regional blocs like ECOWAS, and financial systems tied to the CFA franc. It is not hard to imagine pressure campaigns designed to remind Traore that nationalization comes at a price. Still, the tide of global politics is shifting. Countries like Russia, China, and Turkey are eager to invest in Africa, offering alternatives to the old colonial-style contracts. If Traore plays his cards well, he could leverage this competition to secure deals where Burkina Faso retains majority ownership of its resources. For example, a joint venture with a Chinese mining firm might bring the technical expertise to build a refinery. But instead of owning the refinery outright, Burkina Faso could insist on controlling 60% of its shares. This way, foreign capital becomes a tool, not a master. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For decades, Africans have been told, subtly or directly, that they are incapable of managing their own wealth, that foreign investors are a necessity, not a choice. A successful nationalization flips that narrative. Suddenly, a new generation of Burkinabe youth could see mining engineering, metallurgy, and geology as careers worth pursuing. Universities could adapt, offering new programs linked directly to the growing industries. In time, Burkina Faso could produce not only miners, but innovators, designing African solutions for African resources. But let's pause here and return to the ordinary Burkinabe worker, because ultimately, this is where the story matters. Picture a young man in Bobo Dioulasso, who once dreamed of emigrating to Europe for work, suddenly hired at a gold refinery with a steady salary. He can feed his family, perhaps even send his children to school. Picture a woman in Ouagadougou who starts a catering business that feeds hundreds of workers at a mining site. These are small changes on an individual level, but multiplied across a nation, they redefine what it means to live in Burkina Faso. The risks remain sharp. Corruption, the same disease that hollowed out past administrations, could undermine these efforts if transparency is not prioritized. Without strong governance, nationalization could easily turn into a transfer of wealth from foreign companies to local elites. That is why, as many analysts note, Ibrahim Traoré's challenge is not only external, but deeply internal. How to ensure that the benefits reach the people, not just the politicians. Still, the possibilities are immense. With control over its mineral resources, Burkina Faso could reduce its dependence on foreign loans. No longer would it need to borrow from the IMF under painful conditions, for it would have its own steady flow of revenue. This opens the door to true sovereignty, economic independence that matches political independence. It is the kind of change that could inspire not just Burkina Faso, but neighbors across West Africa, perhaps igniting a regional movement toward resource nationalism. Subscribe the channel and share your thoughts also. Goodbye.